Okay, Excellencies, Minister Rinkēvičs, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's High-Level Roundtable marking the 25th anniversary of Baltic-Nordic Cooperation. And I will give the first word to our host today, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Latvia, Mr. Edgars Rinkēvičs. Mr. Rinkēvičs.
Well, thank you very much and very warm welcome to all our friends from the Baltic and Nordic countries. I'm really delighted to have very old, very good, excellent friends who have been supporting us even before this very important date, before 1991, before we restored our independence. I don't want to make any specific recognitions, but only three names definitely would be needed to mention. One is the former Foreign Minister of Iceland, Mr. Hannibalsson, who has been really great supporter of all our fight for independence, also Iceland being the first country recognizing restored independence of the Baltic States. I also want to specifically mark Mr. Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, who has been also a great supporter when it comes to Denmark, and the great representative of civil society, Mr. Bildt, who used to be the former Prime Minister of Sweden and also Foreign Minister of Sweden. But I don't want to make kind of long introductory remarks. I just want to outline a couple of points we will be discussing today, and I very much look forward for crisp words of wisdom from all of you about what we have achieved in our cooperation in the format of Nordic Baltic countries. I think that if we look back at history, the Baltic states started at kind of ground zero, building their defense capabilities, and I, as the former Secretary of State in the Defense Ministry, want to recognize all the support we have received in building our defense forces, in building our defense capabilities, also promoting the Baltic defense cooperation. The Nordic countries have been instrumental in assisting in the reform process, be it economy, be it political system, but also the Council of Ministers of the Nordic states have been really great in fostering also education, cultural exchange, as well as the kind of people-to-people contacts. Well, so far for history, but I think that we are also here not only to reflect on what great things we have achieved so far, but also the way forward for next 25 years. And here I believe that under the current circumstances, with the challenging situation in the East, the challenging situation within the European Union, with the big elephant in the room, which is called Brexit as well, I think that we need also to reflect on what would be the role of our cooperation as the Nordic Baltic countries within the European Union, addressing the challenges when it comes to security, when it comes to the future of Europe, when it comes to our own destinies. And when we mostly often speak about the kind of future of cooperation, I want to outline only a couple of things. 25 years ago, it was very much the Nordic tier and the Baltic tier. Gradually, we were actually working on kind of putting the Nordic-Baltic concept together. Even now, after 2014, after all the events in Ukraine, with all the mounting security challenges in the Baltic Sea region, we sometimes refer to the kind of Baltic security problem. I think that what we need to understand that we are actually also building to some extent a common Nordic-Baltic security community, even with the fact that there is Nordic-Baltic 6 in NATO and Nordic-Baltic 6 in EU. And even with the fact that there is an ongoing debate on how to increase the security cooperation among Nordic and Baltic countries, within also the framework of NATO, within the framework of EU. Also, I want to underline that we are building the energy community. The projects we started a couple of years ago, like Finnish-Estonian electricity link, Swedish-Lithuanian electricity link, actually are also forging our joint energy community, also assisting the Baltic states to overcome some of energy dependency. I think that we are also building to some extent the joint economic community as well as digital community. And if you look back at statistics, all 8 countries are actually one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. One, as all the data I have from OECD, from World Economic Forum, show also that we are the most innovative region, but still there are many things to do actually to forge this kind of unique community. And I very much look forward to today's discussion as a discussion of reflection, as of course discussion of how great we are, but also as a discussion what we should do in future to even be more coherent region and to be the region that is probably one of the most progressive, most innovative regions in Europe. I hope I haven't taken much of time. I'm also exercising a little bit for tomorrow's visit of Vice President of the United States, Mr. Biden, so I'm trying to get the right tone as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rinkēvičs. So I am the bad guy to Mr. Rinkēvič's good guy. I'm the moderator here to try to impose some discipline on our discussion. So, as you should know, the discussion is divided into 2 halves. In the first part of our discussion, we want to reflect on the last quarter century of Nordic-Baltic cooperation, on the events, of course, 25 years ago, but also on how this cooperation has developed over these 25 years. The second half of the discussion will be forward-looking. That will be the moment to address the challenges that Mr. Rinkēvičs outlined, and the moment to think about how we as a region can best deal with these challenges, what we should look like going forwards. Initially, I'll give a word to each of our 8 panelists here. They know that they have 3 minutes, and of course, all new phones have stopwatches fitted on them. I warn you about this. It's an open question as to whether I actually know how to operate the stopwatch, but let us presume that the threat is there. So we have 3 minutes per speaker, and then we open up the table to questions, to comments, to reflections from our distinguished guests in the hall. And then we move on to the second part of the discussion. So to begin our discussion, I'll pass the baton over to Mr. Dagfinn Høybråten, the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and Your Excellency, Foreign Minister Rinkēvičs, for your kind words of welcome, and also for setting the stage of this fantastic gathering of history and actual politics. I'm representing the Nordic Council of Ministers as its Secretary General, and my reflections on the key achievements and the lessons learned would be as follows. The beginning of the 1990s was a period of geopolitical sea change in our part of the world, thanks to a solid will and support of the people, together with wise maneuvering from the popular fronts in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. The situation could be used to regain independence and freedom. And from the Nordic horizon, we follow this process with great concern. Some around the table here in actually responsible positions at that time also. In the fall of 1990, the Nordic Council, the parliamentarians, and the Nordic Council of Ministers, the governments, agreed to establish Nordic information offices in the 3 Baltic states. Consequently, offices were opened in Riga, Tallinn and Vilnius already in the spring of 1991, before any Nordic embassy was established. In the early years, the Nordic-Baltic cooperation was concentrated on building networks, promoting Nordic culture, and social welfare solutions, and to support the development of democracy and its institutions in all the three Baltic states. In the period surrounding the Baltic states' accession to the EU in 2004, Nordic-Baltic cooperation evolved into an endeavor based on equal terms. It also took on a more structured character. Joint long-term guidelines were adopted, which express the central areas and priorities of cooperation: good governance, social welfare, equality, environment, sustainable development, cross-border cooperation, research, and so on. I think it's fair to say that over these 25 years there have been question asked whether the Nordic presence in the Baltic states should be as it has been over the years. But every time we assess the situation, every time we ask those questions, and those questions need to be asked from time to time, the answer was yes, there is a job to do, there is a cooperation to develop, there is a mutual interest. And the development of the cooperation into mutual and balanced cooperation took place over these years. So now looking back on the 25 years, I think it's fair to claim that the Nordic-Baltic cooperation has been a great success story. Thousands of cooperative activities have been carried out in a variety of areas like social welfare, equality, fight against trafficking, sustainability, culture, etc. Many of those efforts have resulted in and continue to yield rich dividends in the term of mutual benefits, networks, people knowing each other, working together, and so on. This applies not least to the so-called mobility programs and the NGO support programs. Happy to see the civil society so prominently represented here today, which have enabled an enormous exchange of knowledge in the fields such as culture, business, state administration, and civil society. So, what we have seen is a consistent learning curve that has taken us from a juvenile to a mature stage of cooperation, in which I think it also points onward to future progress. And I will come back to the future, but let me say that at this stage, I think no one really questions the relevance of the Nordic-Baltic cooperation and the presence of the Nordic Council of Ministers in one way or another in these countries. I think we have seen that it makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense in a new way today. Thank you very much so far.
Okay, thank you. And now that our co-hosts have spoken, we'll switch to alphabetical order. And so I'll now ask Mr. Petras Auštrevičius from Lithuania, who is a member of the European Parliament and was, I gather at one point, perhaps still the youngest ever ambassador for Lithuania. So over to you.
I was given a historical chance. Ladies and gentlemen, good day to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me and being among so prominent political and historical figures who have been personally present in making decisions who changed the destiny of Nordic and Baltic region. It's indeed a privilege and a possibility. I must remind you that the Iron Curtain went down first time in the Baltic region. It was a process which started here, not somewhere else. And this is an important one, since we defeated the empire of evil. Not everybody is happy with the defeat of this empire or cracking down the Iron Curtain. We hear some voices which wish to rebuild it, but I think we will do everything possible in our powers, not to see it happen once again. The Baltic Sea, in fact, transformed itself and the region itself from being divided to being united. For the Baltics, the Nordic countries were an excellent example of everything. And it was a very strong political and social narrative in our societies in late 80s, early 90s, saying as how our countries would look like if we were developed in a way as our more lucky neighbors in the west or northwest were. And in fact, expectations were very high. Expectations were like, well, in 10 years, 15 or 20 years, we might reach the level of the Nordic countries. Well, socially, economically, it didn't happen, but politically, and by joining the organizations we wished to do in order to reestablish ourselves as Western, normal, democratic, and liberal societies, it happened. So we have to congratulate ourselves and our partners with everything we achieved. It was indeed an excellent cooperation, not just a success story. I would call it even more. It's a historical achievement from countries which were forbidden to cooperate. All of a sudden, they started excellent, natural, and very efficient partners. I assess the Nordic-Baltic cooperation as complementary and as a win-win situation. Complementary since the Baltics were able, to take over a lot of ready experience. We shouldn't look for good examples of governance, of having stable democracy, solid political fundamentals. The Nordics for us were something which we could look at and take the good example and to transform it into our societies. For Nordics, it was a chance, to give or to get, in fact, stable environment, stable neighborhood, if you wish, like-minded neighbors. If you look at different regions in Europe, I think the Nordic-Baltic region is extremely good example, probably the best one in this in Europe. What southeast of Europe lacked a lot. We've been given two sides which were willing, able, and full of good initiative to cooperate. Well, once we've been given a support, which was so important at that time, now the Baltics do our job again. Look, the Nordics helped us on the right time. Now the Baltics do their job helping Eastern Partnership countries in order to reach a level of cooperation and integration with the Western societies much more. And I don't see any end in Nordic-Baltic cooperation. Look, with the accession to EU, we've been given NB6. I see a lot of positivism in it, and I hope this cooperation will bring us not to Euroscepticism enlarging in the Nordic-Baltic region. I hope it never will happen. Thank you.
And now we'll skip over to somebody who has already been introduced several times, former Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and most importantly, our representative of the NGO community today, Mr. Bildt.
Thank you very much. It's very important that the civil society is amply represented. My NGO consists of myself, but that's fairly usual in the NGO community, according to my experience. Some reflections. It's been a quarter century that has gone better than a lot of us feared, perhaps even expected, if we go back to that period in time. And if you look at what happened, it was, of course, 25 years ago, the formal re-establishment of independence, due to what happened in Moscow, primarily. That should not be forgotten. That was the easy part of it. Then came the gradual re-establishment of more real independence. That was the troop withdrawal and withdrawal of other structures and some of the complicated issues of citizenship and things like that that needed to be put in place for the newly emerged or re-emerged states to be truly stable. And then in order to give them even more stability, of course, gradually the integration in all of the structures of Nordic, European, Atlantic, and global integration, with the Nordic Council and the structures, of course, being the most important, but also European Union, NATO, Euro, OECD, you name it. And today we have a situation where the three Baltic states are, as a matter of fact, the most Western integrated parts of the entire Nordic-Baltic region. That has to do both with the economic necessity, but also, of course, with the security imperative due to the geopolitical situation or geostrategic situation. And it should also be add to this, of course, which was mentioned by Edgars, the energy, the financial, the trade links that are part of this particular picture. That's the good part of the story. What then didn't work? Well, Uffe Ellemann was one of those driving the idea at the time of also the new Hanseatic League that we dreamt about. The Baltic coming back as the avenue for trade and integration and cooperation between the wider West and the wider East, that being primarily Russia. And we might have been naive, or we might have been dreaming, or whatever happened, but we had great expectations there, which would have been extremely important for the three Baltic states with the historical position, for example, of this particular town. That did not materialize, and instead of going into the new Hansa, we have gone into a far more complicated period in the relationship to the East. If you look at the structures of integration and cooperation and the Nordic-Baltic, which is supposed to be the focus of our discussions here, I think that these last 25 years have been years of, at best, stagnation of Nordic cooperation. At best, stagnation of Nordic cooperation. And that has to do with the fact, of course, that if you take the previous periods, 50s, 60s, 70s primarily, Nordic cooperation was what we had among the Nordic countries. That was the focus of what the Nordic countries did. We should not forget that it took quite some time, for example, for Finland to be able to be fully part of Nordic cooperation. These are things that are nearly forgotten by now. But then from the early and mid-90s, of course, the focus from Sweden and Finland primarily shifted fairly rapidly to European integration. And the failure of the referendum in Norway in 1995 was, of course, a setback to the idea of us together working within the European context. Nordic-Baltic, of course, has gradually established itself somewhat better, and primarily, I think, in the area of foreign and to some extent security affairs as well. It has become an area for foreign policy dialogue and integration. Whether we call it NB8 or NB6 is not of primary importance in this particular respect. And we also had in the field of security, a lot of things have been happening. Could have been inside or outside the formal networks. If we look ahead briefly, since 2008 and primarily since 2014, it's a new and much more complicated world. So when we look ahead, it will be more difficult in virtually every respect. The South, the East, and the West. And I would say that revisionism in the East is clearly something that is troubling, but I would say that populism and fragmentation in the West might be something that is an even greater threat to what we could be able to achieve in the future. And in view of these developments, more troubling and more demanding, I think there is reason to think anew about the necessity of both Nordic and Nordic-Baltic cooperation in a lot of areas in the years ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Bildt. Now, if I'm doing a poor job of moderating this, I wash my hands of it. The fault for that would actually lie with Mr. Ellemann-Jensen, for one simple reason. Much of the reason why I'm living in Latvia is I spent the first 12 years of my time living in Latvia when I moved here in the early 1990s working for Euro faculty, a project which was founded by Mr. Ellemann-Jensen and Hans-Dietrich Genscher in 1992, 1993. So if I'm doing a poor job, please go up afterwards and speak to Mr. Ellemann-Jensen. Leave me alone. It's not my fault.
Thank you. Well, so far you have done perfectly well, and I'm checking on my iPhone to see if you have found out how to work it. All right. Strolling down memory lane. This day, 25 years ago, was a Thursday. It was the day after some of us, I think Jon Baldvin and I were the only ones present here who were there. We had the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. And we were told in the late afternoon by the then Secretary General Manfred Werner that he just had Yeltsin on the telephone. Yeltsin said, "Hello guys, I'm in control. Don't worry, things will go in the right direction." And when I came home to my house in Copenhagen, Janis Jurkans was sitting there. He had slipped out of Riga, I don't know how, but he had a mandate to establish a government in exile should things go the wrong way. Instead, we could share a bottle of champagne. And on Thursday, all the thinking started how to use this window of opportunity ahead of us. Now, if I had said at that time, 25 years from now, the three Baltic countries will all be members of the larger European transatlantic family, NATO, EU, etc. And not only members, but as Carl Bildt pointed out, members without caveats, members without all the exceptions that countries like Sweden and Denmark, unfortunately, are dragging around with. All right, if I'd said that at the time, people would have deemed me crazy. Because even though our dreams were very, very high, they were not that high. Yet, here we are. And this is why I say to those who sometimes despair and say, well, there's still a long way to go before we reach the point that was once famously described, I think, by Thomas Ilves. Our dream is to become yet another boring Nordic country. Well put, he said it with a twinkle in his eye. All right, there's still some way to go there. But considering what has been achieved in this period, there is no limit as to where we can go. And the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, all right, it has improved. There are many things in which, ways in which it should be further improved. And when we come to the second part, that on the future, we are indeed facing some challenges there that really, really ask from all of us to try to think about our possibilities in a totally new way. But looking back, I think all of us can have a rather smug satisfaction.
Splendid, and exactly 3 minutes. Now I hand over to Mr. Jon Baldvin Hannibalsson, who was, of course, the foreign minister of Iceland at the time that Iceland became the first state to recognize Latvia's renewed sovereignty 25 years ago today, I believe.
Thank you very much. Referring to the Thomas Hendrik Ilves's dream about all of us becoming yet another boring Nordic country, which was his statement of policy, he has withdrawn it. I must, in fairness, let you know. He has said Estonia is now far away in terms of innovation and technical entrepreneurship than any of those old, boring Nordic countries. So, what can we learn from our common experience, quarter century, if anything? What have been the achievements? The Baltic road to freedom was not merely an reassertion of national identity or sovereignty. It was also a democratic revolution. And now we know, and some of us suspected at the time, that it would be more. It could be the beginning of the end of that great totalitarian monster called the Soviet Union. And it turned out to be. So it had not only a regional significance, but truly a global significance. What can we learn from it? Is it too much to put it like this? The leaders of the West at the time might advisedly ask themselves, could we learn something from our mistake in how we reacted to those momentous events? What am I talking about? I'm saying the leaders of the West at the time were so totally preoccupied with what was called the ending of the Cold War, negotiating in partnership with the Secretary General of the Communist Party, Gorbachev, that gradually it became, without thinking, the Western policy, the mainstream mantra, don't say anything, don't do anything that might risk Gorbachev being deposed, because then the bad guys, the communists, the real communists would come back. This was really the policy. And it should not be forgotten that your leaders, independence leaders, when they knocked on the door of Western leaders at the time, expecting, of course, to be embraced as new members of the family of European democracies, they were in for a rather rude shock. They were not embraced, no. They were admonished, they were warned, don't you dare upset the boat. Please don't become the spoilers of the peace. Postpone, compromise, settle for something else, something less, without preconditions. This was actually the policy. The putsch attempt in Moscow disproved it. The hardliners did turn Gorbachev out. They tried their hand and they failed, and they did not take over. And after that, Western policy, if it can be called policy, was actually in tatters. What can they learn from this now when Europe is in a total mess? Because it is. Can they learn from such mistakes? Of course, you should never ever place the hopeful success of your policy on the single fate of a political personality, an adversary, or a friendly person, or whoever. Never. It's a fatal, elemental mistake. Never, never do it again. That's one thing for them to learn, those who are leading in the leadership positions of the West. The achievements, I agree with my friend Uffe Ellemann when he said we would not have dreamt of it in 1991, that this would become quite the success story it has become. Compare it to Ukraine. And then I've said enough, basically. Look at the mess. Why did you succeed and the Ukrainians fail so miserably? Well, across the political spectrum, my understanding was that there was general basic acceptance of the long-term goal. Consolidate our newly born fragile democracy by joining the European family of nations in the European Union, yes, and take out a rational security policy by joining NATO, which is the Transatlantic Security Alliance. And this meant that your political leaders, left, right, or center, they had learned their lessons from history, and they drew the right conclusions. And those goals gave guiding lines, principles that were enough to thwart any adventurism on the way. It gave a fundamental, principled plan of action, which gave you success. Now, the bottom line is this. You joined the family of nations, you joined the European project at a time when we had high hopes for its future. Now, when it is in a mess, it's your turn to try to help us putting back on course again.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move to neighboring Estonia, to Mr. Jüri Luik, a diplomat, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, of Defense, and currently the Director of the International Center of Defense and Security.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister Rinkēvičs, for inviting me. And colleagues, what can you say in 3 minutes about this history? A lot of old war stories, but I don't focus on these. I think it is very important to keep in mind that the Nordic-Baltic cooperation regarding the regaining of independence for the Baltic states started far beyond or far before the nominal creation of our states, which you then supported in many different ways. Everybody around this table using the means they had, some being in NATO, some being outside NATO, but having a very strong sort of NGO and party political affiliations which allowed to support the Baltic states, the Finns being occasionally in a very complicated political situation, but putting enormous money to help us through the NGOs. I mean, this was a whole network of cooperation, which I think was fundamental in the Baltic nations actually managing to create what are now the 3 independent countries. The second point I would make is, I mean, let's be honest, the efforts of the Nordic countries to support Baltic independence and to support our fragile independent countries were also very much dependent on the security interests of the Nordic countries. I mean, it wasn't pure pure selflessness, although that was clearly one of the aims. The destruction of the Cold War structure around the Baltic Sea region, breaking up that structure, avoiding the 3 Baltic territories being a springboard for Cold War type action. I mean, we were during the Cold War, the Baltic Sea was effectively a lake, an internal lake, very much, of the Warsaw Pact, with respect to 2 countries who were also around the Baltic Sea. That was possible. It was a possibility to break that, and I think that was of utmost importance to all Nordic countries. And finally, the role of the Nordic states in knowing the Baltic situation, but at the same time knowing well your partners in the West, the big Western powers. I mean, it was clear that it was not enough to help us with your own weight, but you had to bring the weight of the major European powers and the United States to the play. So, in an interesting way, you were both our advocates in the big countries, explaining our issues, also our concerns, our worries. At the same time, you were advocates of those big countries in the Baltic states, because we were fundamentally suspicious of the motives of big powers in doing almost anything. So you coming to the Baltic states,
rightly so.
Yeah, rightly so, often. You coming to the Baltic states and trying to hone out a compromise on many of these complicated issues, I think played a very, very crucial role. I personally felt it during the complicated issue of negotiating the withdrawal of Russian troops. I mean, for instance, Carl Bildt played a crucial role. I'm also very happy to see here Lars Fredén and Thomas Bertelmann, who, as part of Carl's team, played a crucial role. And I knew, as a negotiator, that they had a direct contact with the White House, and they were capable of bringing me valuable knowledge of what they believe is going on. Obviously, I had my own contacts with the White House, so I was able to check what you were telling me. But I think you made an excellent job in helping us. And finally, the future. I will come back to it later. Thank you.
Splendid. Okay, and now we move on to Mr. Kimmo Sasi, a former President of the Nordic Council and also a former Minister of European Affairs and Foreign Trade of Finland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honourable friends, I think there are 3 major achievements in the last 25 years. We have made, first, Baltic Sea not the dividing line, but a line of cooperation. And Nordic-Baltic State cooperation is very important. Coming from Finland, so we have to fight all the time whether we belong to the West or East. And Nordic family has brought us to the West and been the cornerstone for the Western cooperation. And I think it's very important that there's a brand of Nordic-Baltic cooperation linking the Baltic states to the Nordic states and that Western cooperation. And I think this message should be sent to Mr. Trump as well, that he knows where we lay today. The second thing is membership in the European Union. I remember when we prepared Helsinki summit in 1999, so it was not at all clear that Baltic states would be on board. Some were afraid that German influence would be too big if those countries join, and that would be very costly. However, we were able to convince that at least one of the Baltic states can be or must be a member, because it would be a wrong signal to Russians if there is no Baltic states on board. And the second thing, what was very good, finally, as a compromise, so all applicant countries except Romania and Bulgaria were taken as negotiating partners. And I think that indeed puts Baltic states in the right family, in the right house today. And third thing is Baltic Sea economic area that we have spoken since the beginning of the 1990s, that has guaranteed that there have been quite a lot of Nordic investments in the Baltic states. And there has been some kind of guarantee that there will be level playing field that's fair to all companies, and that has been very helpful for the growth of the economy, because we have to remember, as long as there's well-being and growth in the economy, people are satisfied and developments can go in the right direction. Then, lessons learned. I think what we have in common is the Hansa period, the same roots into history, and I think it's very important that we don't look at the telephone today, but we don't know anything of history. It's very important that we teach our youth in all our countries our common roots and of our history. And then the second thing is that actually in the beginning there was great enthusiasm in the Nordic-Baltic cooperation. In the middle of the 1990s, I remember in the Nordic Council we established 3 committees, one for the European affairs, one for the cooperation with the neighboring countries, and the third one for Nordic affairs. I happen to be the chairman of the committee for the cooperation with bordering areas. But then suddenly, 5-6 years later, so that committee was demolished, because actually then we went back to the Nordic affairs as well. And that was okay, there was steady progress, no fears, so there was not that pressure anymore. But we have to remember, we have to fight for the change all the time, and I think we have to do something to strengthen the cooperation between Nordic countries and Baltic countries, and to that I come later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then to close the first tour de table, we have from Norway, Mr. Michael Tetzschner, a member of the Parliament of Norway.
Thank you. I will start to remind us of all the remarkable achievements made by the Baltic states the last 25 years. For my personal experience, I remember my first visit to the Baltic area. It was to Vilnius. I had to apply for a visum through the Soviet embassy in Oslo. And this was, and the purpose of my visit was to extend the political contacts to Vilnius in particular, and Lithuania. And this was because the Norwegian government was some way embarrassed by taking a decision how to react to the liberation in those times, and it was easier for them to respect the Baltic states more like counties, and then it became a task for me as a leader of the city government of Oslo to be the first icebreaker. Last time I visited Riga, nobody asked me for my passport. So there has been great achievements. We must also admit that during the period from 1918 and in the post-war dominance of the conflict between East and West, a lot of democracy had more to see to than be concerned about the minority states within the Soviet Union. So I think it's we should reflect on how easily we forgot the suppression of the Baltic states. It was not on the table, it was not discussed. And we as a part of the real politics, which minor states always has to respect, we didn't even think about the situation we later got. So in this part I would like to conclude that what we must do now is to work intensively together to be assured that the history never will repeat itself. And we will learn from our hard-earned experience to ensure that we will not do the same failure before in the history. And we also remember that even in the western part, we put self-imposed restraints on our own discussions, not to be annoying neighbor for the Soviet Union. Thank you.
Thank you. And at this point, we'd like to open up the discussion more broadly into the hall for reflections, comments, even questions. My only consideration would be to keep it brief and to introduce yourself. So, I open up. Of course, Mr. Pabriks.
Of course. I mean, I still do not represent NGO, just European Parliament, but not far away. The big picture, what these great men here have been painting today is like a kaleidoscope. It consists of very small stones. And each stone is giving its own light, so we see something big. And I would like to say and use this opportunity actually to say thank you to them for what they have been doing for my small piece, particularly like Uffe Ellemann, who did not know me at that time. But thanks exactly to these initiatives of Nordic countries, I had a chance to be maybe the first PhD in political science in all three Baltic countries when I was studying in Aarhus for 5 years. And I left the country exactly during those events, which was January 91. I would say that just like with Daunis, you are responsible for whom we became and how much we have been contributing to either politics or academia or many other issues. So these 25 years have not been, as we would say here, totally wasted time. But, of course, what we did not discuss here up to now, and I think we should use the remaining time also a little bit for future, I think it's important what Karl mentioned. The big danger is our fragmentation and populism. Because for the Baltic states, the fragmentation of those achievements of membership in EU, membership in NATO, the global order and institutions which have been strengthened in the last decades. For us it is differently from many other Western European or Nordic countries. For us it is an existential threat, an existential issue. So if we can find a way, as Baltics and Nordics together, at least stand against this fragmentation, at least stand against this populism which is taking over increasingly the West. That would be probably one of our duties as sane countries and sane people. So I think this is where we have to do something. Thank you.
Thank you, Artis. Although you were dipping your toes into the waters of a future there, which we're trying to sort of keep to the second half of the discussion, but I understand the context there. But we would in this part like to have sort of reflections on the last 25 years or the events of 25 years ago. So again, I open up the table.
Thank you very much. My name is Kirsten Viering. I was the first Danish ambassador to Latvia. When we look at what actually happened 25 years ago, and also now venturing into the issue of populism, I think I would like to underline something which really struck me about the Danish profile when I arrived here. Of course, when the Nordic countries engaged so very much in the defense of the Baltic states, it had to do to some extent with security. But looking at the Danish profile, there was certainly also, and I think this is important when we now discuss populism, there was a true element of altruism in what the Danes did. I think there was a feeling very much in Denmark that, you know, the fate of the Baltic states could have been our own had it not gone differently after the Second World War. And that paved the way for an enormous popular support, which again translated itself into a popular involvement in a multitude of engagement and activities in this country. This also spilled over into other areas and into, for example, the area of security and the withdrawal of the Russian troops, where the Danish role was perhaps very much under the radar, but again in very practical terms. Broadly based on an involvement by all Danish ministries, also paving the way for example, rehousing of Russian soldiers in St. Petersburg. That popular involvement and that, what should we say, intense involvement in Nordic-Baltic issues is perhaps something that you would miss a bit today. There was an enormous dynamic fiber in the Nordic-Baltic environment. I am today ambassador to Paris, so it's a bit further from my day-to-day work. But one would wish that even though things, of course, have become normal and boring, that we could somehow return to that more dynamic fiber of Nordic-Baltic cooperation. Whether that is then up to the Nordics, the Balts, or both of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Veiko.
Yes, Veiko Spolits, MP from Latvia. As soon as populism was touched here upon, there is one issue which is popping up in Latvia now. It's a question which is recurring again and again about the treatment of the Soviet soldiers and the withdrawal of the Soviet troops. So using this opportunity when Carl is here, because the troops had to be withdrawn from all three Baltic states, but obviously the situation was different in Estonia and Latvia. And now when we hear from some populist corners in Estonia and Latvia, in particular in Latvia, that actually it was a pressure from the West about making those military personnel staying here, but we know retrospectively now that Estonia and Latvia dealt legally differently with the Russian personnel. What recollections you have? What can you say looking from 25 years back on these moments? So how was the situation dealt with in Estonia and Latvia?
Well, ask Lars Fredén, who probably has some more detailed recollections of it. But it was a question of withdrawal, and Jüri as well. Withdrawal of a couple of different things. First, you had the withdrawal of the active Soviet army units. That went fairly smoothly. At some point in time, I think the sort of general staff in Moscow decided that we need these troops elsewhere, and sort of the regular forces were withdrawn. The most significant regular forces were in Lithuania. Lithuania was the key thing, and that happened before the others, strangely enough. So that sort of the regular withdrawal went fairly okay. Then we had, which was the sensitive issue in your countries, particularly Latvia, well, that was the pensioners. Because under the Soviet military system, if you had been an officer for X numbers of years, I think you had the right to be a pensioner in Latvia, and they thought that Latvia was a nice place, rightly so. And here it was a very complicated discussion that ended up in a compromise, which was not very popular, I think, in Latvia, but where I took the view anyhow that at some point in time, also these people are likely to die. So it was, which most people do. So it was a temporary issue that was going to fade away over time, and I think that has sort of broadly turned out to be true. The third issue was the question of strategic installations, which were very sensitive, and the problem was that when we looked at it, some of them were, at least one of them, were important for objective reasons. Paldiski, because I mean, that was the training facility for those that were sort of running the Soviet nuclear submarines. And we had an objective interest in even that Russia having proper training for its nuclear submarine, those running the reactors. And until that time that they could have an alternative facility to train their nuclear submarine crews, there was an objective Western stability interest in them retaining Paldiski. And we had during 5, 6, whatever year transition period. Sorry? Yeah, true, with Skrunda. True, Skrunda was the other one. Yeah, but then the commander was allowed to be there for some time. But no, it was true, it was shorter. Skrunda was the 5-year period, yes. Yeah, for the old facility in Skrunda has to be said. Could I, when I have the floor, just close down this? Sorry, I closed down. One critical, bloody hell. One critical question which I asked myself in those days, talking with sort of people in Russia, the friends that we had there, to some extent still have. I asked them, do you really accept the independence of the Baltic states? Is this something that is just sort of a historical thing that will pass, or do you truly understand that these countries want to be independent and will remain independent? And I remember even sort of the democratic friends that we had were not very clear in those particular answers in those days. Boris Nemtsov, good friend, he was going to, in the beginning he said no question about that. He said this was a temporary thing. I would say that one of the achievements of the last 25 years is that has changed. I do think that there are fringes in Russia, needless to say, there are dangerous movements in Russia, but I think the fact that these 3 states are independent truly for the foreseeable future has been broadly established with the Russian political culture. And if that is the case, that is truly important from the historical point of view.
Thank you. Are there any more further comments? Yes, Jānis.
Jānis Vucāns, member of the Parliament of Latvia and simultaneously president of Baltic Sea Parliamentary Conference. We spoke today here a lot about NBA format, but to my mind also this Baltic Sea Parliamentary Conference is very important format of cooperation, and if at the beginning there was Baltic countries and Nordic countries, now we are together and we have partners in this organization coming from Russia, coming from other great country, Germany, and not always those discussions about the past and about the future of Baltic area is so easy. But I would like to mention one very important key factor in our past. And down is mentioned Euro faculty. And if we are looking on this table, here we are at least 4 or 5 people that are coming from this system. And to my mind, for Baltic countries, this first reform of higher education coming from Euro faculty was very effective and very important. Myself, I'm coming from academic environment, and I participated in this reconstruction of economic field in Latvia. Daunis participated in political field as well as Veiko and in some part Artis. And to my mind, at least for Latvia, this was very important step to educate our young generation in these traditions of Western education system, Western education traditions, and so. And looking in the future, also, I know that there will be another part of discussion, but we need to think also about this education and research aspect. It's very important for Baltic countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jānis, for reminding us about the social dimension of integration. And we have one more comment down there.
My name is Rinkēvičs, and I was earlier representing the Danish Cultural Institute, and was establishing the first institute in the Baltic countries in '90 from Denmark, and I'm very happy to be invited. Thank you. I just wanted to supply a little bit to what Kirsten Bjerring was saying about the people's involvement in this process that was going on, because the Danish Cultural Institute, in fact, was established on money collected from the Danish people, and so it was here in Latvia. There were donors from Latvia also, and I would just say that you're talking now about the meaning and the importance of the education, and I would say the cultural links are very, very important too. I just saw that when we were the first ones to open, people came running, and we had the first people-to-people connections through cultural and educational and folk educational links. And I am a very, very strong believer in the great power of people-to-people connections, and to culture as the third leg of the foreign policy, as the Danish Cultural Institute is now formulating it. So I think this should be kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think with that, we'll bring an end to the first part of our discussion. And now we'll be rather more... Oh, was there one more? Maybe in the second half. So we'll turn to the second half now, which is the aim here is for us to be rather more forward-looking, to consider some of the challenges which are already brought up by the Minister and by others here at the table. In the immediate sense, of course, we have Brexit, rising population, the challenge of migration. In the long run, we have things such as rising inequality in Northern Europe. We have sluggish economic growth. And, of course, the great security challenge coming from the East. So in your remarks now, I'd like you to be a little more forward-looking and to think about how Nordic-Baltic cooperation can deal with these challenges, whether we need more Nordic-Baltic cooperation, whether we need a different kind of Nordic-Baltic cooperation, and whether it is sufficient for dealing with these issues. So we'll go in the same order as we did the first time round, and I'll immediately pass over to Mr. Dagfinn Høybråten.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. It's truly been revealing to listen to this conversation. It's a lot to learn. At the same time, I want to make take one learning from what has been said about the development of the cooperation. The fact that the Baltic states today are the most integrated in Europe, and that you really have passed by the Nordic countries of being integrated in Europe. I think there is a challenge in this, but it's also an opportunity looking forward. The challenge is dealing with fragmentation and populism in Europe. I think staying integrated and becoming more integrated is something that should be on the minds of Nordic as well as Baltic leaders. And a regional integration is not a threat to a wider European integration. It's actually a strength that can build a further and stronger European integration. So I think the NB8 is a format to do so. And with the NB6 in the European setting and the NB6 in the NATO setting, there is a potential of filling out and synergizing that I know is being made use of, but I think it can be still utilized even more in this context. Looking at the Nordic Council of Ministers and its role in the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, I'd like to say that I feel it's more important now than ever, but it's also a time to take stock and to really see are we doing it the right way, and what are the important targets. So we seek to both consolidate our accumulated gains and to explore new territories. A few examples out of the basket. I would like to mention that we have cooperated in various means and ways lately to promote the development of independent and investigative media in the Baltic states. This has materialized in support, for instance, to training courses in investigative journalism here in Latvia, and to the independent TV channel ETV Plus in Estonia, and to also other projects on media literacy, more broadly oriented. We have also provided support for the development of democracy festivals in the Baltic countries of Latvia and Estonia, which are inspired by the major political meetings in the Nordic countries, such as renowned Almedalen and more lately Bornholm. So I think these are ways also to build on the people-to-people and socially engaged populations in the countries. When it comes to societal security, it's another issue of growing topicality. It's about resilience, which means ability to prevent and manage and recover from a wide range of threats, non-military threats against the democratic system, critical infrastructure, and social cohesion. I think there is a lot to build on, but also a lot to learn from each other in the Nordic-Baltic cooperation in this respect. Geopolitical factors were one of the decisive reasons behind the establishment of the Nordic offices in 1991. Today, the geopolitical situation in our part of the world is again characterized by uncertainty and complexity and apprehension, and therefore we need to remember that the core values of our cooperation are about security, solidarity, and joint progress. So we are not only in the same boat, we're around the same sea. We have so much in common also in the context we are operating in. So if you are of the conviction that the international regional cooperation is an indispensable instrument for dialogue and for promoting joint security, economic growth and welfare, it's hard to see that Nordic-Baltic cooperation is not continued with a high degree of relevance. I can assure you that the way I hear the Nordic governments, this is a clear priority going forward, and I know it's appreciated by the Baltic governments. And together, I think we can continue this path of pursuing joint efforts and common interests.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Auštrevičius.
We have to cooperate on it, no matter is NATO or non-allied countries or NATO partners in the region because of security and stability. Security and stability agenda is back to the regional agenda, and we see reasons behind. And I don't see any contradiction with our more cooperation with the pro-democratic forces in Russia. I hope there are still some of them, very fragile, very individualized, personalized, but we still have to invest lots of our attention and time and resources in order to keep those individuals and institutions go there. And finally, strengthening regional identity. We're not to invent a common language. There will be no common language. I mean, we have, and we understand each other perfectly well. But we have Vikings lottery in the region, which is widely popular and so on. But we should have something more on literature prizes, on common competitions which would explain our history to people not through the lips of politicians, but through the writings, through culture, and indeed people-to-people contacts to keep any homophobia away from our region would be great. And let's invest into this as much as possible.
Thank you. And Mr. Bildt.
Looking ahead, I think the challenge is primarily the economic demographic challenge of the three Baltic states. There has been convergence, no question about that, but the convergence has been slowing down, particularly since 2008. There's no longer the convergence that we were hoping for, that the three Baltic states are within foreseeable future going to be able to catch up with Nordic standards. That's not where we are at the moment, but that's where we and you must be, also in order to overcome the demographic challenge that is very clearly here in your countries, and has to be said, even further to the east. The security challenge is back in focus, primarily since 2014 or 2008, however you want to look at that. But I would say that is related to outstanding two things. First, which I mentioned, the unity of the West. As long as the unity and the strength of the West is more or less assured, the security challenge is manageable. Where there to be a fragmentation of the West, then all bets are off. That has to do with the future of the European Union, but also to some extent, at least, of NATO. And it has to do, finally, also with the coherence of your societies. I don't think this is an acute issue. It was an issue that concerned us quite a lot. 20 years ago, something like that. I think it's been managed rather well, has to be said. But I think it is an issue that should always be something that is in focus and not to be forgotten. So with the unity of the West and with the coherence of your societies, I think the security challenges should be manageable, and focus should be on the economic and demographic challenge, where more efforts are needed. Thanks.
We have to repeat it. Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ellemann-Jensen.
Thank you. Now, reflecting on the past could easily lead us to a situation of, complacency. And if you look around in the world, this is certainly not time for complacency. Just look what's happening. Brexit has changed the balances in Europe and has landed a former dishonest journalist as head of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You are seeing raving nationalists moving around in the Netherlands, in France, in some new democracies in Eastern Europe. You have a Donald Trump attracting support from a surprisingly large number of people in the United States, a Trump that by Anne Applebaum this morning was described as an American version of a Russian oligarch. And then you have a Putin moving around. No more need to be said about him, but the challenges we are facing right now do ask for some healthy minds. Now, if the Brexit materializes, and I still regard it as an if, because I fail to see how it should be possible, practically speaking. But if it materializes, there's going to be some interesting new balances in the powers of voting in the European Council. And if you start calculating on that, you will suddenly see that the Nordic Baltic 6 in the EU will possess some interesting numbers in that mathematic. Numbers that could give us the possibilities of pushing forward initiatives and of stopping initiatives from others. And we are sorely going to miss the bridge if it comes to the Brexit, because we look like they look upon stuff like free trade, security policy, etc. And these are all areas where there are dangers that things might be moving in the wrong direction unless we in our group put our act together and start to combine the forces we will have there. That would ask for this group of countries to be much more practical in coordinating policies in, first of all, the European Union. When it comes to key areas like maintaining free trades, defending external borders in order to get back to a situation with open borders. Using a passport to get into Sweden, I haven't done that since I was a boy and went there the first time in 1951 with my mother. Fortunately, I have got a passport as honorary ambassador of Skåne to the European Union, and they are accepting that at Malmö. They are accepting it. Probably never seen that before. But right, we all share an interest to get back to normal. Dealing with security issues, the threat from Russia. Well, this has to do of keeping all the Putin-versteher that you see moving from Berlin to Moscow these days, some of them even in government positions, telling Putin that, all right, just relax, just keep pushing, and we will all get back to normal, all right? We have a joint opportunity and a joint responsibility to make sure that the EU does behave. Energy policy, all this discussion about a Nord Stream 2, all right, what is the right answer to that? That is to push together for finally establishing a joint energy community. When you had already the Nord Stream 1, tell me why did we not make sure that the so-called Amber pipeline was then built from Germany through Poland to the Baltic countries? No doubt a lot of Greece was paid out, like some German politicians were bribed, others were bribed probably as well. All right, we'll have to get to the bottom of this and together push for the establishment of a joint energy policy. There are so many things that remains to be done and that can be done if we put our act together. So the future is going to be very interesting.
Thank you, and maybe Mr. Hannibalsson can tell us some more about this interesting future.
To my mind, it makes very little sense to enter into a long discussion of Baltic-Nordic cooperation unless we concentrate on the big picture. I have, during the last few, weeks, months, been a little bit on the road in academic circles, think tanks in Germany, in France, in Spain, and I must admit that I am surprised at the level of denial of the seriousness of Europe's problems. Number one, the European Monetary Union is a failure. It was meant to be the high point of integration, of bringing nations together. It has become technically a non-workable instrument and politically bringing nations apart. The solution, so-called austerity, is a failure. It is worse than the disease it is meant to administer or deal with. The financials, Europe is in a prolonged, miserable economic recession. The economic performance of Europe is miserable. Even Germany is stagnating now. The financial system, which was rocked by the 2008-9 crisis, is still unreformed. And basically, it has overgrown the real economy to such on such a scale that it is an instrument for continued and accelerating inequality, which at a political level is absolutely unacceptable. Look at a country like Spain, with a level of unemployment of young people approaching 50%. And they are taking pride in having been able in 3 years through this austerity-imposed policy of reducing the overall unemployment from 26 to 23%. What sort of a miserable performance? We should not be surprised that there is a deep undercurrent of political backlash at an impotent leadership which doesn't look squarely into the eyes of the problems and doesn't have any solutions. And to that extent, when I said in my previous talk, is it too much to ask that the leadership in the West should learn from the mistakes they were making way back in 1991 in dealing with the political transformation then going on? The European leadership is not dealing with the problems. They are in a state of denial. If you look across the sea to America, you actually see a man, an ignorant, blabbering, bullying psychopath, having overtaken the party of Lincoln. But here's one thing of what he is saying is truthful. He is saying Europe is taking a free ride in the defense and security system vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, and he is going to look at it. This is true. There are a few honorable exceptions, but Europe is not dealing with the common threat and not dealing in practical terms with, in terms of defense and security and unifying their industries and doing their duty. And the transatlantic alliance to that extent is in open danger. Think if this man whom I was describing actually would become the President of the United States, what sort of consequences would it have? Disastrous. Why is this not taken seriously? Why are we just mumbling about that we will somehow muddle through and have tiny solutions here and there? Europe is in a mess. That's it. But you have to fix it.
Okay, thank you for describing our interesting future. And Mr. Luik, perhaps you have some answers for how Nordic-Baltic cooperation can deal with this.
I don't know about answers, but let me focus on security issues. It is not a secret that Russia has changed. The new resurgent Russia has changed the rules of the security game around the Baltic Sea. But I think we also have to keep in mind that NATO has, as a reaction of Russia's movements, changed its posture when it comes to the Baltic Sea region. I mean, NATO is actually, when you think of it, doing something revolutionary in bringing the Allied troops to the region and to the Baltic states. Let's remember that obviously there are no Allied troops in Sweden and Finland, but there are no Allied troops even in Denmark and Norway. So it's really kind of a push forward. I think it is very important, and I believe this has a positive effect, a stabilizing effect for the whole region. But I also believe that it is very important that we would have a very detailed and continuous security dialogue, so that we would understand each other's motives, information we have, to exchange information, share concerns, etc., so we can also help each other in these complicated issues of security of today. And also, which I think is very important and greatly underestimated, now that NATO has moved forward, I am sure that President Putin will be more inclined to use different kinds of peace initiatives, quite apart from his previous approach of being more realistic. I think in a real Cold War fashion, Putin might be open for various peace initiatives, but not necessarily real peace initiatives, but propaganda peace initiatives. So I think it is very important that we have a continuous dialogue even on that front. You know, for instance, let's take the last important issue which is now on the table, which is the famous flying without the transponders. Now, there was an initiative by the Finnish president, which was, I would say, overtaken by Putin, who is using it for basically his own ends, to split the Western community. I think it is very important that also in those terms we would have very close contacts and very deep discussions on what are we actually proposing and what does it actually mean. Because I think, for instance, if we would make a proposal, perhaps even a joint proposal, on transponder issue, we also should have immediately answers to questions. What is the forum which we should discuss this issue? What is the legal framework? Is it a purely civilian aviation security issue, which I believe we should treat it as? If we would bring it entirely to the military realm, this would be this would be a road to this kind of Cold War type sort of pro and con debates, which are not helpful, I think. This is a real issue. I mean, I'm not underestimating the issue, and there is a possibility of civilian aviation catastrophe happening. I mean, there is a potential issue on the table, but how should we play it is another question. So I think cautiousness here is greatly important. Now, one of the big security issues which we are already facing is, let's say, in simple terms, dragging the Baltic states out of the Russian energy grid or out of the Russian energy ring. It's a very complicated security issue, and we have already seen the Russian boats harassing the cable-laying ships who are laying the North Balt cable near Lithuania. And there are other moves in that direction. Russia clearly is not interested in us leaving the circle, and we are facing a number of political and technical problems. But I think in the end, regardless of how complicated and possibly costly it is, we should do it because it's another sign and another real sort of move towards security, independence, and switching to the European approach in energy policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Sasi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The future is more difficult to predict and propose something that should be done than the past. And as said, there are two challenges: security and economy. Security, because of Russian new power policies, and unfortunately, if there is any isolation in Britain and the United States, so that will be very harmful. And as far as economy is concerned, so we see in Europe, so we are not very willing to take new technology into use, but we usually try to protect old interests, and that is not good for the economic growth. As far as Euro is concerned, so I think there's one problem, that is Greece, and if you had let Greece to go for 4 years ago, things would be much better, because if you don't follow the rules, why should you be in the boat? But there's a long tradition in the European Union, you don't take any steps backwards. Well, as I said, I think in this security situation, we have to show that we are in the same family in the Nordic Council and Baltic States. And it means that we should give more visibility to cooperation Baltic-Nordic. Okay, there's a proposal that when ministers meet, there's always declaration. Declaration is not enough, there must be substance. Okay, we should try to make decisions, or if not decisions, at least deal with, for example, infrastructure questions in the European Union and things that interest press and the public. And even if I say, if you don't agree, disagreement is a news as well. But in fact, that there's something told of the cooperation, so people know that they sit at the same table. I think that is very important. Then, what is in fact very important is that now we are 6 members of the European Union, out of 28, maybe 27, and we have influence. And I think we should better coordinate our activities in the European Union. We should have more often joint ministerial meetings electronically before the Council of Ministers meeting in the European Union, but to coordinate what to be proposed and what to say in the Council of Ministers meetings. And I think as well, to show that there is more cooperation, and that has been proposed previously, so we should have joint committee meetings between the national parliaments' committees, and especially I would say between the European affairs committees, between the Nordic countries and Baltic states, to coordinate that politicians know. And now what has been done, there's a meeting between the members of the European Parliament, and I think that is the most important forum where you should have meetings quite often, and indeed convey the message from all countries, and if you indeed can agree, that can play a role. Then, implementation of the directives of the European Union. Now we discuss in the Nordic Council that it would be very helpful if we implement the directives in the same way, because if we don't do it, we usually have borders between our countries, and free movement of people, trade, goods and so on can be endangered. And okay, if you can get it work within the Nordic states, it's great, but indeed if you could enlarge that cooperation also to Baltic states, well, 6 countries, more difficult, or 8 countries, more difficult, but I think we should give a try at least, and I think that would be very useful and helpful. Then I think also economic legislation. So if we want to have common Baltic states economic area, or Baltic economic area, so we should have as harmonized economic legislation as just possible. And okay, we should look into if there's something we could do in this respect. That's a very difficult task, and if you could do something in that respect in the Nordic Council and Nordic cooperation, so okay, that could be a good start, but indeed taking the Baltic countries on board could be quite useful. And my last final point is, I remember in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a very good cooperation between the political parties in Baltic states and Nordic countries. Today, people came from Baltic states to my party's institute, and they were trained, told what democracy means, how parties work. Today, the cooperation is not working very well, in fact. And if I look at the party structure in Baltic states, I think there should be more stability, and in fact, maybe a bit more in line with those party fractions we have in the European Parliament. But however, I think it would be very important that we should have common meetings within the party lines, between the parties in Nordic states and Baltic states. And always, you can get good ideas from other parties, what could be done, what should be done, and I think that could develop even the parties' policies in our countries and could be a good step forward to indeed establish a good party structure in all our countries. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sasi, for these very concrete initiatives you put forward. And Mr. Tetzschner.
Thank you. Self-complacency is not helpful attitude at this point. We have a tendency to use much of our speaking time to assure that we have the best countries, and in many ways we have it, but for the time being we must also be able to face our big strategic challenges. A revanchist Russia, eroding stability in the greater Middle East, causing migration waves, a weakened EU, and recently uncertain American leadership. I will underline that what NATO needs urgently is a determined political leadership to restore its power and purpose. The NATO nations have begun to respond to these challenges slowly. They are reversing the harmful cutbacks in defense spending in the past years. But in spite of all this progress, there's still more to do. The July NATO summit decided to shift a far greater proportion of capability into the Baltic States, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and also into the Arctic. NATO leaders should reaffirm NATO's fundamental purpose to advance and defend Europe whole, free, and peace at time of renewed danger. NATO allies must continue to hold the line against Russian aggression until a new generation of Russian leaders agree to comply with international law. We must also commit to greater military spending among NATO allies. We must take more extensive steps to strengthen the collective defense against a full range of cyber threats, also to be prepared to adjust our defense against hybrid warfare. We all must acknowledge the link between economics and security. Restoring economic growth and prosperity is a strategic imperative for the democratic states to sustain their institution and the support by the electorate. We must recommit in all the NATO countries to strengthen our collective democratic foundation and the rule of law. And this has also to be told the leaders of Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. They must demonstrate the commitment to ensure full freedoms and civil liberties of their citizens. Brexit has set EU in movement. The future is uncertain. A remedy will be to increase and intensify the more Nordic-Baltic cooperation. The most important elements will be to make it easier for private business and investment, but let me also add that urgent task should be to ease the burden of the energy dependency, and there could my country in particular play an important role. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've heard some very differing opinions on what the issues are and how we should deal with these challenges. So perhaps at this point I might ask the Minister to make a few comments about what he's heard and how he sees the future.
Well, first of all, I discovered that there is great difference between the former foreign ministers and the actual one. The former ones can always speak their mind up, and whenever I do that, then I get immediately into trouble. That's unfortunate situation, but on the other hand, just a couple of quick points. Maybe to some extent, like it or not, but we are coming also to one issue that Carl actually mentioned in his first introductory statement about the history, that the Baltic states are currently more integrated in the West than Nordic countries. So in the ideal world, I would say that I would use next 25 years to get NB8 for both, for the European Union and for NATO, even if it is very difficult in some countries. But I think that at some point in time, if we are seeing the security challenges in the region as we do, I think that this issue, what we were not touching upon, and that always Baltic politicians like to speak whenever they visit any of Nordic countries and remind about the NATO membership to Finland and Sweden, and to some extent having fun also with Icelandic and Norwegian colleagues when it comes to European Union membership. But I think that at some point in time, this is going to be an issue that is going to be discussed. And I think that, of course, it's up to the societies and governments in every country, but still I think that if we come to the situation that is not going to change anytime soon anyway, and to the positive dynamics here, then we are going to discuss probably this also. I think that we can really say that there is a fairly good level of cooperation so far. You mentioned about the meetings of chairman or chairperson of the European Affairs Committee of the national parliaments. Actually, they are happening all the time. Chairmen of the Foreign Affairs Committee are meeting all the time, coordinating. Foreign ministers are having their breakfasts when it comes to the NB6 in the European Union just before Foreign Affairs Councils or the European Council meetings. The prime ministers are having the same kind of coordination. So this is not where the actual issue is. I think that what we need is probably to coordinate more on issues that we are interested in. Eastern Partnership being one of great policies we have been working together. I think that the Arctic neighborhood is something that we can actually work more together, even if we are not part of that immediate neighborhood. I think that Brexit is also posing the big question about the future of what we have developed jointly with the United Kingdom, the Northern Future Forum, where the Nordic, Baltic and UK Prime Ministers, business communities are coming together. But then there are also some actually challenges we are facing, and we are trying to cooperate and to shape the response. 3 years ago, nobody would talk about the strategic communications as part of Nordic-Baltic cooperation. Right now, we are doing that as a part of our routine cooperation to tackle the effects of Russian propaganda, especially after 2014. So we are still working to address issues on energy challenges we have, and it has been mentioned, but also we have still some issues of transportation networks to be developed. Basically, we are talking about Rail Baltica project, which is in reality and in the ideal world to be connected, to be addressed as the link from Helsinki via Baltics to Europe. But then there is, of course, a greater challenge that we still need, and I think that Carl was also outlining to that, as well as some of our colleagues, that yes, after 2008, after the great financial crisis, economic crisis, we have the challenge of convergence with the Nordic countries. We still have in the Baltics a lot of issues to tackle, like corruption, economy, demographic issues that are related with our own resilience to many challenges. And that's where I think that to some extent the Nordic-Baltic cooperation can get a kind of more dynamism, as some people were referring to 1990s, as well as science education. So to some extent, there are so many good things that we simply need to continue to press. And my final point is that I think a couple of years ago, we were talking with our Nordic friends about the need to keep the presence of the Nordic offices of information in the Baltics. There was an idea that the job has been done and we can close down those offices. I think that the common sense prevailed and we still have those valuable instruments. But I also think that we in the Baltics should also think how to increase our presence in the Nordic countries through also cultural, educational presence. Those are things, of course, we first of all need to address when we talk with our own ministers of finance, but still I think that those are very important ones.
Okay, thank you. And at this point, I'd like to open up for a broader discussion, and we actually have here, and here. And I think we'll tackle the comments separately. So,
thank you so much. My name is Michael Metz-Mørk. I was actually the second Danish ambassador to Latvia, and was here with Rikke when we opened the Danish Cultural Institute, and I'm today the Director General of the Danish Cultural Institutes. Very happy to be here. I know we have very little time, so I think I'll just make one major point. Our two wonderful, strong Danish women in the group touched it when we looked at the past 25 years. That is the basic power of soft power. We tend, when we move in political circles, to talk about structures of hard power. They are extremely important. But please do not forget that all these structures that we are all committed to and wish well and will develop as far as we can are based on emotional commitments from people who need to be able to commit their life, blood and soul to whatever those hard power structures demand from them. And if we do not keep alive the soft power contacts between real people, the real life and blood of international human relationships, then we lose the foundations that we need for the hard power. And I'm a little bit worried that if we do focus too much on hard power, we tend maybe to forget the cultural relationships and the human relationships that have to be nurtured, that have to be continued to be developed. We have had years in Danish internal political debates before we started to get very bad people from the Middle East. We had very bad people from our new neighbors. And it created a sickening atmosphere that simply did not promote mutual understanding across the Baltic Sea. We need to be very careful and try very hard to reestablish those powerful umbilical cords that connected us at the beginning of the process 25 years ago, and think constructively of reinventing mechanisms that can reignite the popular excitement, commitment, and mutual love that we shared 25 years ago. We should maybe do it in many different ways, but I think we need to help each other to come up with constructive ideas on that dimension. We need culture, we need the Nordic Council of Ministers, we need the Latvian Institute, the Danish Institute, and all the other Nordic institutes and Baltic institutes to develop those human networks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is René Nyberg. I'm former Finnish ambassador to Moscow and Berlin. I spent a great time in the 90s working with the Baltic countries, and I know Latvia quite well from that time. I wanted to say a word about Russia. I wanted to say a word about Germany. I do agree with Carl Bildt that Russia has accepted the existence, the independence, and the fact that the Baltics are what they are, and they're lost for Russia. This is an enormous achievement, and it's actually an achievement of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I'm sure that the Warsaw decisions of NATO have stabilized the situation, which is of enormous importance for Finland and Sweden too. There's a new element to Russia, in which I noted the other week. I realized that there are people in Moscow, NGO people, who are desperate. They are moving out. And not one, but several of them are establishing themselves in Riga. They're buying property. I'm thinking of a very respectable lady who told me her story. She's selling her apartment in Moscow and is about to move here. This is a very interesting new element, which is quite complicated also. Then a word about Germany. There's a wonderful bon mot from Helmut Kohl from sometime in the late 90s when he at the very end of his period, his chancellorship, visited Riga and looked around and said, "Das ist ja wie Lübeck ohne Parkhäuser." This is like the city of Lübeck, but without the parking houses. And this was Germany then, but we have a totally different situation now. If we think about the Bundeswehr committee to NATO presence in the Baltic States, Germany, there will never be a stable situation in this part of the world if, as long as Germany is not fully committed. We all remember from the 90s and even later in the noughties that it was very difficult to interest Bonn, Berlin for issues concerning the Baltic Sea cooperation, and it was actually something which was referred to the Länder bordering on the Baltic Sea, but it was never a federal issue in the way it is more or less now the case. So this is something which I think we should pay a lot of attention, that Germany will be committed and engaged in our region. Thank you.
I am Romuald Stražuks, member of the Latvian Parliament and former chairman of Latvian Popular Front in 1990 and 1991. So I'm listening to what Carl Bildt and Uffe Ellemann-Jensen are speaking for some 25 years, and thank you. It was quite productive listening. But what bothers me today, actually I remember last conference of Nordic Council in Reykjavik, in the framework of which all 8 prime ministers of our countries met. It was unanimous views and politically almost no contradictions or differences. And I think the main difference between Nordic countries and Baltic countries now, and it endangers our security, is difference of social guarantees. Difference of social guarantees now 25 years after our independence restoration. We are still at the point where maybe Nordic countries were in 50s, not if earlier. And I think that it's essential question now how to overcome these differences in possibly shorter period of time, because our people, they do not want to hear anymore about Maastricht criteria and all this stuff. They really want some real changes. It's understandable that differently from our recovery after the First World War, when everything was in place after 10-15 years, after this communism, it's very different, it's very difficult. But we have lots of Nordic businesses here. We have Chamber of Foreign Investors. Maybe it's still possible through our parliamentary cooperation, through our government cooperation, through all these institutions, to find and suggest additional mechanisms how to overcome sooner this difference in social guarantees, in healthcare systems, accession, because it's really now #1 question for our societies. And I think that's why populists can touch also our political landscape sooner or later, and we can be in big trouble.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Carlis Neretnieks, and I've been engaged a bit in the military cooperation between Sweden and the Baltic States. I've made an observation during this discussion that things have really changed, looking back and looking into the future. today you can really ask, who are the security providers in the Baltic Sea area? Earlier it was obvious, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, but today, to my mind, that has changed quite drastically. I would even say that today it's payback time for you from the Baltic states. Now it's your turn to help us, the Swedes, and to some extent the Finns, to integrate in the security structures that have evolved here in the Baltic Sea area. So one area of cooperation in the future, or let's call it a wish from my side, is that you take the lead to integrate Sweden and to some extent Finland more in the structures that you are building. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Elita Tsakula, Norwegian Association of Local and Regional Authorities. I would like to touch upon a well-known concept, which is a Nordic welfare model. And the cornerstone of the model is social dialogue and dialogue between the employees and employers. And one of the achievements of this 25 years is actually the freedom of choice. Among the others, where to study, where to work, and where to live. And we experience that young, well-educated people, they choose the place, the working place that with administrative culture, working culture where they are heard, where they are seen, and where they can participate in the decision-making. So my question or encouragement would be how could Nordic-Baltic cooperation could be used, well, to develop Nordic welfare model into Nordic-Baltic welfare model. Thank you.
Yes, as Veiko said, more money would do it. And there was another comment.
Well, thank you. By way of introduction, I was Consul General in Leningrad in 1988 and was accredited to the Popular Front in Riga. That's how it began. It's not easy to add anything that has been to all the things that has been said, but I think the question looming here a bit is that will the tougher times ahead bring us closer together? In 91 to 94, I think you did everything right in a very short window of time. And there was a great concentration of mind to do the right thing. Now we see more clouds on the horizon, and listening to Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, we have the power to be very influential. And Jüri Luik points out the interest that we have. And Foreign Minister Rinkēvičs points to the mechanisms we have. But do we have the concentration of mind? In some sense, we are 8 peripheries. And we are absorbed by larger questions and torn in various directions. And I think there is a need for a conscious effort to realize that we can make a difference, but it would take more out of the present politicians than we see. We cannot just complain on the leaders of the big countries on the continent. We have work to do at home too. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. We have a film screening, maybe some screaming as well, who knows, but a film screening at 20 minutes past 3, so if we want to squeeze in a coffee break, we'll have to wrap it up now. However, I hope that we can continue some of the discussions that we've started, and we seem to be on the same, let's say on the same side. We all agree that tremendous advancements in Nordic-Baltic cooperation over the last 25 years, challenges to come. I hope that when we meet in 25 years' time, and I hope the Minister is planning that, for 50 years of NB cooperation, we'll be looking back on another 25 years of successful cooperation. I'll now give the floor to Minister Rinkēvičs for some brief concluding remarks.
A very brief concluding remarks. Thank you very much all for being here. As I said in the introductory remarks, we have remarkable set of good friends that over 25 years have developed a very personal relationship, and well, I don't think that we need to wait for another 25 years. We can always come back in a year or 5 years' time and to look back in the past, but also not to forget about the future. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for Nordic Council of Ministers for hosting this, and also for being a very good partner to the Foreign Ministry. And the coffee is waiting, and the film is waiting, and the challenges are waiting also.